Okay, so here we are again, and now we are switching from one city to the next. First one was London, or yeah, mainly London and the British situation in general. And now we're looking at the German situation. So in Berlin, the problem of overcrowding, rapid urbanization was bad. In fact, was much worse than what we saw in London, and London was already bad, right? So if you look at the scale of overcrowding, what has been 7.6 inhabitants per building in London has been much higher, has been in the 50s. Somehow the number disappeared here, but this should say 52, I believe, for Berlin. So the problem of overcrowding is much worse there. And also in Berlin, public had to find a way to deal with this problem of rapid urbanization, overcrowding, and how to manage the whole problem. So next one. What they did in Berlin was a different approach. So what the strategy is that you would make an extension plan of the city. What you see here in the darker hatch is the old center back in the days, and this lighter hatch is the extension plan. So that simply means that you are kind of prepared when rapid urbanization happens. So at the moment people migrate to the city from the countryside, and you already know where they would go, or you would know how to extend the city. So it's already defined where the streets are, what are the housing blocks, and that already helps a lot, because you have to imagine, if you have an unplanned urbanization, people just come to the city and live wherever there's space, build their own little sheds, make their own little paths. That this creates a very confusing, chaotic structure, and once that structure exists, it's really difficult to get it out again. That is actually one of the problems that Seoul had after rapid urbanization, and a lot of other cities as well. So this is one of the good qualities of that plan that the planners of Berlin made in order to create an extension plan where everybody would know already where the streets are, where the housing is supposed to be, and also how the housing looks. You can see that here. The housing has been kind of standardized. All of it should be built with these 5-story buildings, relatively simple and straightforward. And on the inside, these blocks would have courtyards. So different from what we've seen in London, right? In that old city structure where you have one perimeter block. In fact, the urban blocks in Berlin are much deeper and consists of houses with courtyards. We'll see that in more detail in the later slide. So yeah, again, the quality was that you already know where the streets, where the infrastructure goes, and it's much more easy in this way to provide the basic needed facilities like sewage system, freshwater system, and so on. Here you can see the structure from aerial view. So you have the urban block, but different. There's not one big courtyard or shared courtyard as what we've seen before, but there's lots of small courtyards. So obviously What they try to do is use these urban blocks as efficient as possible, and these courtyards were relatively small. In fact, they were decided, the size of these courtyards was decided by the size of a water hose, by the fire brigade. When the fire brigade comes in, they have to be able to put the fire out with the water hose, and that one has to rotate and needs a minimum radius. So that decides the minimum size of these courtyards. Yeah, here is again, you can see the number, inhabitation number that I was missing on the earlier slide, 52 people per dwelling, whereas it was 7.6 in London. So this kind of tenement housing became the dominating urban typology in Berlin, and this was also a mixed-use, very compact city. That means that in this typology you have combination of housing and small manufacturing, restaurants, bars, maybe little shops, and also, yeah, bars or other entertainment facilities. So in fact, these courtyards and these urban blocks were quite lively in itself. And here you see an image of one of those courtyards. It's not luxurious at all. It's very straightforward housing, trying to provide the number of houses needed, not trying to be fancy. So this is housing for the masses, right? Here you see a study of those courtyards, and you also see that in this typology, different from other ones that we've seen before, you create an issue with safety, security, by having this combination of courtyards. If you look here, you can see maybe this one you need to pass from the outside on the street through one courtyard into the second courtyard, and then you can enter your building. And you can imagine the further you get away from the big public space, the street, go into one courtyard, it's already a little bit dark and maybe shady, and then from there you go into the next courtyard, can create a feeling of insecurity. Even though maybe the space is not insecure, you might just feel insecure because, yeah, it's so hidden away in that second. Sometimes you might even have a third courtyard that you need to enter to access your building. Some examples you see over here. The facades, very different, inside and outside, treated differently. Outside, of course, is representative, kind of grand facade with a high ground floor. Ground floor is also the place, of course, where the shops and the facilities are, maybe post office, maybe bar or restaurant, and so on. This would be the better apartments on the first and second floor, and above that would be the cheaper apartments. So here the idea is also that different income groups would live together, the more wealthy, less wealthy, and you would have all kinds of facilities of everyday life close to you. So that makes the typology very compact and urban, and from today's perspective, that is actually something we would like, that people are trying to achieve in cities that are built new. Here a section through one of those courtyard blocks. Also you see a high level of repetition in the architecture. If you look at the plans, you see, similar to what we also saw in London, central staircase, central corridor, relatively small units, and the toilets are bundled and they are for shared use. Here they are outside in the courtyard. Another image where you can see like the sequence of different courtyards, one behind the other. You can imagine how you might feel less and less safe going from one to the next. Yeah, here's some caricatures that I liked because they show, yeah, in an entertaining way, the liveliness of those courtyards, and also the shady atmosphere, where you can see here this kind of gangster type on the one hand, but then you also have kids playing and other, some kind of show, looks like a circus. So it seems like very diverse things happening in these courtyards, but also pretty run down and a place where you rather not have to live if you have the choice. These slides are about Lex Ardicus and Frankfurt, which I'm going to skip because they're not so important for what we are doing. I just want to point out one thing, as we talked about rules and regulations earlier when we introduced what they did in London. Also, Ardicus was thinking about new ways of organizing, new land policies, new regulations, how you could manage the transition from like agricultural society to urban society, manage that migration. Well, he introduced something that's called land readjustment. This land readjustment has been transferred also to Japan, and through Japan came to Korea. So this is more something that is, nice to know, that at the time when rapid urbanization was difficult to cope with in Germany in the 19th century, that this idea how to deal with it through land readjustment has been picked up by other countries and transported around the world. And in fact, most of the developments in Korea from the 60s to the 80s, early 80s, have been done with this land readjustment tool. We'll talk about that more in a different lecture. So now you've heard about that already. More information about Frankfurt, that's not so important for us right now. I go right to Amsterdam. So Amsterdam was coping with a similar set of problems: rapid urbanization, overcrowding, health issues, safety issues, and so on. Situation in Amsterdam, beginning of the 20th century. But one thing they did differently in Amsterdam, which was quite important from an architecture point of view, is that they did not only think about how to manage the amount of people, they would also think about the quality of the space they provide. So they tried to do two things at once. So one is increase the quantity of the housing, so more people have a decent place to live, but also increase the quality. So that means spatial quality, architectural quality. And of course, what you see here, the quality of the facilities of the house. This is kind of repetitive, overcrowding, poor conditions. And then there was this plan of a city extension in Amsterdam South, the south of Amsterdam, which you can see here, the first municipal plan. So in a way this looks similar to what has been done in Berlin, right? This would be like the grid layout that defines how the city extends, where the streets are, where the housing blocks are, where the infrastructure goes. So very efficiently, with this type of plan, the developers could start building, and good or new housing can be provided. But in Amsterdam, this was not good enough, they thought, and they wanted something of a plan with a high quality. So this is what you see. This is like illustration. They didn't just want a plan that fulfills the basic criteria of hygiene, but a plan that gives city extension a new image. So they were thinking in architectural terms as well, right? Like what architecture does is provide image, identity, and experience. And so they wanted a plan that also fulfills aesthetic criteria. For that, they called Berlage. Berlage was one of the most famous modern architects at the time, innovative and new and Dutch, so they asked him to make a plan. This is the first plan he made. Looks like he took the idea of high quality space a bit too literal or a bit too serious. When you look at this plan, you see lots of open green spaces, park-like layouts. Here with some kind of recreation, sports facilities, and then this would be housing blocks. But overall, density is quite low, right? Then there's even a second park over here, which was nice. People loved this plan, but it was not providing enough density, not enough housing units. So then they asked him to make a second plan, and that was this one down here, which has been also carried out. So here you see that it's much more diverse than the original plan from the city hall, this one, right? This is very repetitive and in a way boring. And here you see much higher diversity of public spaces, so different type of streets, major streets, smaller streets, alleys, and also different types of housing typologies, bigger blocks, smaller blocks, and so on. So in order to provide a clear structure, he's using quite classic Baroque instruments, which are these big axes, right? He's using important buildings. This one, for example, is train station, another one over here, and creates axes in between them. These are obviously the main aortas going through that urban plan, and then having secondary streets, tertiary streets. So it creates a lot of diversity in the plan, and of course much more density. So this plan was very much applauded by City Hall and also the people, and implemented in the end. Yeah, here you see same thing again. One of the funny thing is that if you look at a Baroque plan, we'll take a look at that in the City Beautiful lecture, then there would be like an important building of the whatever the king or the emperor, which or the pope, would be located at the end of a long axis. And he's a modern architect. He uses an old tool with his axis, but he chooses a new modern building to be at the end of that axis, which is then the train station in this case. So much more rational idea of planning, but still using some old Baroque tools. Here again you see this central axis, the symmetry he uses. So he's not completely modern yet. A big building imposing on the end of that axis. And here in this beautiful render you also see those urban blocks, right? This is very typical for Amsterdam and Netherlands in general, where you have perimeter blocks, relatively narrow, on the street side, creating one continuous facade, and then you would have courtyard. In this courtyard either has individual, like small gardens, or is shared. It depends on the block. Another image, same thing. Here you see the train station at the end of this axis, and just a beautiful render. And then a recent photograph, bird's eye perspective, just to show that maybe you can say that the plan has some quality, because more than 100 years later, the plan is hardly changed. Right? You still have the same layout, the perimeter blocks, the courtyards in between, the streets. It's still all there, it's still all used and occupied, not deteriorated, yeah, well maintained. So that speaks for the quality of the architecture as well. If people want to live there and people maintain it well, then it can survive for a long time. So successful plan, you can say. And with Berlach, that's interesting because he works on different scale levels. He's an architect and an urban designer, and he pulls through his ideas from the very big scale to the smaller scale. So this is one example where you see first maybe designing urban scale, this 4 or 5 floor perimeter blocks, and then he goes further and defines them in more detail. For example, in this urban plan, then he would say, over here there needs to be at the end of the block where it connects to the next one, there has to be some kind of tower. Right, so this should stick out. Here's another tower. Here's another tower. So that helps you to orientate in the area. That creates a clear identity. And you would also revert to the architecture style that is in fashion back then, which was the School of Amsterdam. School of Amsterdam was a very expressive brick architecture. You can see that here, trying to make very curvy, expressive buildings, mainly in red brick, curved shapes, and white window frames. Yeah, together with red roof tiles. Very, very typical. So also trying to make use of the architecture style at the moment. Different examples. Not so sure how much I personally like it, but I kind of admire that the urban designer was thinking in so much detail about how to create an identity, how to pull through an idea from the urban scale to the architecture scale, and even towards like the detail, where you say maybe, you know, the corner of this building has to be accentuated, and then the architect comes that designs this building and makes this weird shape. And whether you like it or not, it does contribute to the character and identity of the building. And in a way, he's one of the prototype kind of architects. He didn't have a big office. He had a small group of people he worked with, and would work this out mainly by himself, similar to how an artist would work, simply by drafting in his studio for hours and hours until the plan was perfect.